Hello, my name is Stephen York. I'm the pastor of the United Methodist Church in Stonington, Maine. This week's sermon is entitled, Love is Complicated. It talks about the complications when Joseph receives a message from the angel telling him that Mary, his fiancée, is with child. I trust that as you listen to this message, your hearts will be inspired to new hope and possibilities in relationships. Thank you so much for tuning in. This week I'm preaching on love is complicated. And I have to tell you a story about what happened when I went down to the Island Advantages. It was the last week that Sue Senecal, who many of us know and appreciate, was working at the Island Advantages as a sales rep. And I made it a point to go in to thank her and to give her the title of the sermon. And I discovered that some anonymous angel had placed a separate ad in for Christmas Eve. And that was the first thing she told me. And I said, well, that's wonderful. And I said, well, then let me give you the title of my sermon. And so there are people in the office, and they're all doing their business. And she said, what are you preaching on Sunday? And I said, love is complicated. And the entire office started laughing. And somebody said, isn't that the truth? So that was my beginning for getting this into the ad. As Nancy noted in her preface to the reading of the gospel this morning, very little is known about Joseph. He was older than Mary. We know that he was a carpenter because when Jesus was 12 and got lost, separated from the family, and he was confounding the teachers in the temple, that is, Jesus was, they said, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph the carpenter? And that's the only clue that we have that Jesus' father was a carpenter. But he was older than Mary. I don't know how much, but she was quite young. And I cannot tell you if this was an arranged marriage, as was very often the case in those days. It certainly wasn't the current method of finding people, which is get on Facebook and look. I don't know if you've ever noticed on Facebook, but sometimes something pops up on the see who's been looking for you. I tend not to believe anybody's been looking for me because it seems somewhat suspect. However, the bottom line was that Joseph and Mary were, in the words of the Bible, betrothed, which was a little more weighty than what we understand to be engaged. They were engaged, but it was a legal contract. It was an understanding that these two belonged together. And to get out of it, it would have required a divorce. Now, one of the things about divorce in both the Old and New Testaments that you may or may not know is that only the male had the right to divorce, not the female. True in Old and New Testaments. And so Joseph and Mary are engaged. They are betrothed. They are legally committed. And as in the past 2 weeks I have told you the story about Mary getting the news about this birth, I don't really know what she did with Joseph. I mean, I'd like to assume that there had been some prior communication before the angel showed up in Joseph's dream when he got the announcement. What do you do with news like this? I mean, do you throw in a little Sinatra and get out the best wine and say, honey, I've got news for you? I mean, it was complicated. Mary herself didn't understand really what was happening to her. I mean, she knew that she was with child, but, you know, how do you explain all of this? I can assure you, I'm not going to try explaining it this morning. I want to talk about how complicated it was. It was extraordinarily complicated. Just think what it must have felt to Joseph to have this news dumped on him. How complicated his life became. I mean, this was not in their plan. I can assure you that. They were planning to be married and have their children like anyone else in their day or today. So it was complicated. Joseph gets a dream from an angel in the text of the Gospel of Matthew. It says, don't worry, go ahead and be married. My question as I think about this story is, what do we do with the truth that love is complicated? That love is never clear. You know, I think that they laughed at the newspaper office because somehow it resonated with them that love indeed is a complicated process. It's never quite easy. People are not perfect. They always look perfect in the beginning. You think, my God, I've just been given a gift from heaven. And then people get together, and after a while, we realize we have married people who are very human. Or we have significant people in our lives, maybe even friends who are very human. But love is complicated. I'm going to tell you this morning, I don't think that it was the angel's message that kept Joseph in that engagement. I think that in spite of all that he was facing, it was his love for Mary. The Gospel of Matthew says he could have put her away, which means divorced her. Under the law, a person like this could have been stoned. And I don't mean on drugs. I mean they could have been put to death. But Joseph chose to love. I wish I could tell you that at Christmas time that love and relationships are easy. That everybody always has a fairy tale existence where we live all happily ever after. There's a new book of fairy tales that came out about 10 years ago. It's called Once Upon a Midlife. And it takes all of the fairy tales, or many of the major ones, and talks about what happened to some of these Cinderellas and Prince Charmings halfway through into midlife. And it is absolutely a priceless book. I've owned one for a long time, and then I went to Goodwill the other week, and I found another copy, and I said, I know somebody's going to want to borrow this, and I don't want to loan out my original, so I'm buying a second copy. What do we do when the fairy tale fails?